All right, well, welcome to the second lesson in our course, Early American Poetry. This is a month-long course, just running through the month of August, and is going to serve as our preface to the fall semester on the American Renaissance, in which we'll turn our attention to Emerson, Thoreau, Dickinson, Whitman, and so we'll be actually reading a little bit of Whitman in this lecture today. So I'm hosting this course to my student patrons on Patreon. Students here are with me live and will join me afterwards for a small group discussion around the Puritan poets. And in this lecture, we're going to cover three major Puritan poets: Anne Bradstreet, Michael Wigglesworth, and Edward Taylor. Now, in this class, I want to get us thinking about what poetry meant to the New England Puritans and how it served as a method of education, communication, devotion, of course, but also beauty. And poetry means different things for different people, groups, and different eras. So to help us think about this, I've planned for our discussion, I'm going to be reading the prologues. Those are the introductory poems of each poet, each one of the three poets. So we'll be closely reading a poem in which the poet outlines his or her philosophy of poetry, in which they adopt this posture before the reader. They're very interesting, the Puritan poets. They have to explain why they're writing in verse, and it leads one to ask, why do they have to give an explanation for what they're doing and why they think they can do it? And each one of them is very concerned about getting that right. And so we're going to be thinking critically about what that posture means for each of the poets and how it fits into the significance of poetry and how this played into early American identity. So we're going to start with Anne Bradstreet. She was the first woman poet to be recognized poet in the New England world. Prolific, acclaimed poetry. Her first volume was called The 10th Muse, published in 1650. And it said that King George III in the 18th century is said to have had a copy of her book in his library. She was born in 1612 in Northamptonshire, England. She is not colony born. Her father was Thomas Dudley, who was a steward to the Earl of Lincoln, and this meant that she had a good education, and she was probably tutored. And one of my questions a couple months ago about Anne Bradstreet was she homeschooled? And they wouldn't have called it that, but she would have been, yes. You would have had a private tutor. She would have learned languages, probably Latin, Greek, perhaps, maybe Hebrew, probably not though. But she would have been well acquainted and had a good education. So it was in 1628 when Anne married Simon Bradstreet, who was her father's assistant. So they met that way. And the Bradstreets and the Dudleys both immigrated to America in 1630. They were on board the Arabella. And this was with the Puritan exodus led by John Winthrop. And of course, these early years in Massachusetts, as we talked about last week, were very difficult, very tough. The mortality rates were very high among the settlers. Anne Bradstreet thrived. She managed a household. She raised 8 children, and she produced a significant body of poetry. And her work often reflected the tension between her, on one hand, devotion to Puritan beliefs, her allegiance to Puritan beliefs, and her personal struggles in testing faith. And it was on the grounds of poetry in which this tension was worked out. But what's interesting is that even in her earliest work, the quality of her experience was distinctly different from that of England. And in her book, The 10th Muse, which was published in England, not in the colonies, but in England in 1650, contains descriptions of what it was like to live in the New World. One of her poems is called The Four Seasons, and it describes in heroic verse the seasonal patterns of New England, which would have been very interesting for English readers for a number of reasons. I mean, the seasons were more important then than they perhaps are now, or at least they were nearer to human life than they are now. So much of one's life was regulated by the rising and setting of the sun, by the conditions of the weather. And those of you who are on the call who don't live with AC or electrical lights, are aware of how much the rhythms affect one's life. So Bradstreet's The Four Seasons document the conditions of seasonal time in New England, which differed greatly from England. The summers and winters very much the same, but it was the autumns and springs which were different. The autumns in New England are drier and brighter, more colorful than they are in England. And so I just want to show a portion of that poem now. And by the way, here's a picture of Anne, a sketch of Anne Bradstreet. It's not actually her. This is a 19th century reimagining. But look at how the artist has depicted her. Her face illumined by the daylight from the window, the pen poised in hand, eyes raised piously above the world of transient pleasures and woe up to the eternal. And it's interesting too, she has a set of keys here. I think this is signaling she's the manager of the house, especially when her husband's away, as we read about in some of the poems. He often went to Ipswich, and she missed him greatly, but it was she who managed the house. And we see two, looks like some books on the windowsill. And it's interesting that there are two books. If there had been one book, we would know what book that was. It would be the Bible. But there are two. And it's interesting because it seems like to have two books on the sill instead of just one in this depiction is signaling to her education. Perhaps, the two most popular books for a very long time in this period was either the Geneva Bible or the King James, usually the King James, and Fox's Book of Martyrs. So perhaps it's that, but also perhaps it's a textbook. Perhaps it's Greek or Latin poetry. And so I think this is very much signaling to her education. A fascinating image. But okay, to autumn. Back to autumn. This is an excerpt from the Four Seasons. It reads, "Of autumn months, September is the prime. Now day and night are equal in each clime. The 10th of this Sol riseth in the line, and doth in poising Libra this month shine. The vintage now is ripe, the grapes are pressed, whose lively liquor oft is cursed and blessed. For naught so good, but it may be abused, but it's a precious juice when well it's used." She's master of the heroic couplets here, the pair of rhymes here in iambic pentameter. Each line has five stressed syllables. We've got balance here, not only with the rhyme, but with the content. Poising Libra. The poising Libra means a balancing Libra. And there's this sense of equality, as though the world is going into harmony in September, where the days and nights are equal. There's no preference over each. The lengths are the same. You have the poising Libra. But also, too, you notice this is when the vintage is ripe. This is when the grapes are pressed for wine. But she's got this ethic of moderation. The lively liquor of the grapes is good. It's often cursed and blessed. For not so good, but it may be abused. So she's saying everything in moderation, including wine. But something key here is, and this is signaled by the picture, is that there's a second book of Revelation for the Puritans. There's the Bible, which is the special. Then there's nature, which is the general. So perhaps we have the Bible depicted here, education here, and then outside, beyond the window, is nature. And in a lot of Puritan poetry, especially Bradstreet's and Taylor's, nature signals divine truth. So autumn here symbolizes God's providence, his providing of things for us, the vintage, the earth is bringing forth goods. So it's this idea that's always in the mind of the Puritans, that the world we see outside is a picture of the spiritual world above, and that's where she's got her eyes, in that picture. So Bradstreet demonstrates this range of style. This is a very, we might call, neoclassical style, written in the 1650s. So this was very popular with Cowley, Ben Jonson, many others. This is the mode of serious poetry. If you want to be considered a serious poetry, you have to master this style, you have to write in it and do it well. And this is what she's doing. At first, in her book, well, The Tenth Muse, it's the only book published during her lifetime. It's very elaborate after the manner of the English Renaissance and neoclassicism, with allusions to classical myth and the adoption of classical modes like this. But it seems like in her later life, once she has proven herself as a serious poet in the high style, she feels permitted to lean into a more Puritan and plain style. And this is where we get verses like where she's missing her husband, or the verses on the burning of her house. Her elegy on Sir Philip Sidney, which we saw in the material on the course, is an example of her classical style. She's very adept at the rhetorical at her rhetorical skill. But her poem Verses Upon the Burning of Our House, July 10th, 1666, is of the Puritan plain style. It doesn't have this elaborate, ornate style. And here's the beginning of it. And hold this in mind, because she's writing this after Michael Wigglesworth's The Day of Doom, which you're going to turn our attention to next. Begins, "In silent night when rest I took, for sorrow near, I did not look. I wakened, was with thundering noise, and piteous shrieks of dreadful voice." So let me just admit this person here. "That fearful sound of fire and fire, let no man know, is my desire. I, starting up, the light did spy, and to my God my heart did cry, to straiten me in my distress, and not to leave me succorless or helpless." It's written in tetrameter. We have 4 stressed syllables instead of 5. Still written in couplets, but it's tetrameter. And this is, whoops, there we are. This is very similar to what we're going to see in Wigglesworth. Initially, her work did include these allusions, poetic embellishments, but after time, she developed this more straightforward approach to better express her spiritual reflections and to align with the Puritan mission of the Massachusetts-based psalm book, which we saw last week. This poem ends with a turn. Right as she's lamenting the destruction of her house, she then applies this spiritual turn. Here it is. I'm skipping down a bit. "Raise up thy thoughts above the sky, that dunghill mists away may fly." She's speaking to herself, doing what the psalmist does. Many of David's psalms will do this, will complain and then address the soul. "Thou hast a house on high erect, framed by that mighty architect, with glory richly furnished, stands permanent, though this be fled. Stands permanent, though this be fled." Very visceral imagery, dunghill mists. And you could see the smoke still lingering off the charred embers of her home. Her early works included these elegies, these historical poems that grapple with the complexity of the inheritance of literature, of literary legitimacy. But in these later works, such as this poem here, Bradstreet's style becomes more introspective, focusing on personal and religious themes with this clear, unadorned diction. And her poetry often explores these themes of faith and family and the transient nature of life. I think that the genius of Bradstreet's verse, where she really shines, is the way she beautifies and spiritualizes domestic life and womanhood to a large extent. Her poetry was the voice of a woman. It was the voice of a mother, a wife. And she was bold in casting these themes as subjects of her poetry. And she did have great precedent for doing so. You had the Hebrew Psalms themselves. And we had some discussions back in office hours about the two traditions, the two large traditions, I should say, the one classical Greek and Roman, the other Hebrew. The classical poets take up the high subjects of valor and action. The Hebrew poets take up subjects of everyday life. You can pretty much classify almost any English poem within either of those two traditions. And they trace back, maybe they go through Wordsworth, maybe they go through Milton, maybe through Spenser, but you can trace it back to these two modes usually. And Bradstreet proved herself in both modes, classical and the Hebrew Puritan mode. Now, where Bradstreet's poetry was largely in the tradition of the Hebrew Psalms, Michael Wigglesworth, the other Puritan, was indebted to the Hebrew prophets. And here we find the first of that white-hot, mobilizing genre of the American Jeremiad in verse. A Jeremiad is a social poem that decries corruption in politics or in a community. It takes its name from the prophet Jeremiah, the book in the Old Testament, who Jeremiah was a prophet who preached against the corrupted powers of ancient Judah. And when a poet takes up this mode, usually called Jeremiad, and there's a great tradition of the American Jeremiad, and it really begins with Michael Wigglesworth. He was not born in the colonies. He was born in England, in Yorkshire, in 1631, and he immigrated with his family to New England in 1638. So he came 8 years after Bradstreet and her family. Wigglesworth faced significant personal challenges, but they all did. He had a mysterious illness that prevented him from performing his ministerial duties. And following the death of his first wife in 1659, his health just got worse. So despite his physical ailments, or perhaps because of them, he turned to writing as a means to serve his community and to continue his religious vocation. Now, Wigglesworth's poetry is marked by its adherence to the Puritan plain style. We're going to read a little bit of it in just a moment. It's characterized by a very straightforward language, a didactic purpose. And we're going to see this being a very strong fiber in American poetry, to speak plainly, to speak the language of people. His most famous work is called The Day of Doom, published in 1662, and this is really emblematic of his approach. As readers today, we may find this poem grotesque, even kind of horrifying, and outlandish. But it's important to sympathize with our poets as much as we can, considering their motives in light of their theology. So Wigglesworth gives us a hint of his poetics in one of the prefatory poems of The Day of Doom. I just want to share that. And he mentions a poet whom you all know well. A verse may find him who a sermon flies, saith Herbert well. Great truth to dress in metre becomes a preacher, whom men's souls doth prize. That truth in sugar rolled may taste the sweeter. No cost too great, no care too curious is to set forth truth and win men's souls to bliss. You see how the poem begins with this preface, that poetry is used as a tool for the Puritans largely, especially for Wigglesworth here, as making Christian doctrine sweeter, making it something more tolerable, awakening men up, people up, through a mode that might make them more receptive than simply a sermon. And also, there's this sense that Wigglesworth is locating himself within the tradition of Herbert. And he writes poetry that's very, very different from Herbert, different mode entirely. But it's interesting that he quotes him. So let's read the first few stanzas of The Day of Doom. And remember, this was written in 1662, 4 years before Bradstreet's house burned. Bradstreet would have read this poem. She might have even read it to her kids and her grandkids, but it begins in a very similar way. And in the beginning, we can see how Bradstreet incorporated that, probably drew on it consciously. All right, so here's Wigglesworth. Still was the night, serene and bright, when all men sleeping lay. Calm was the season, and carnal the reason, thought so 'twould last for aye. Soul, take thine ease, let sorrow cease, much good thou hast in store. This was their song, their cups among the evening before. there's this underlying sinister sense, I think, communicated here. The next stanza. Wallowing in all kind of sin, vile wretches lay secure. The best of men had scarcely then their lamps kept in good order. Virgins unwise, who through disguise amongst the best were numbered, had closed their eyes, yea, and the wise through sloth and frailty slumbered. Like as of old, when men grew bold, God's threatenings to contemn, who stopped their ear and would not hear when mercy warned them, but took their course without remorse, till God began to pour destruction the world upon in a tempestuous shower. And then skipping down to the fifth, this is when the terrible moment when Christ returns. Very scary. It was something to be hoped for by the Puritans, something to look forward to, something also to keep in mind to terrify you into righteousness. And here's the fifth stanza. For at midnight breaks forth a light, which turns the night to day, and speedily a hideous cry doth all the world dismay. Sinners awake, their hearts do ache, trembling their loins surpriseth, amazed with fear by what they hear, each one of them ariseth. And it goes on, and it gets graphic and descriptive of the horrors of this day of doom. I taught this when I taught for Eliza New and her Poetry in America, and we taught this poem, and she has a really great way of describing it. She said it was the America's first horror. I think she described it horror classic. It was America's first bestseller. It resonated deeply with the early settlers, selling out in its initial print run and becoming a cultural touchstone. And I think Bradstreet shows just how much this has been part of the texture of Puritan culture. It's got this vivid imagery, this theological clarity, which provided comfort and moral instruction to a population grappling with all kinds of uncertainties in the life of the New World. And the poem's written in this meter of 7-foot 14ers. It's a long poem. It consists of 224 of those 8-line stanzas we read. And it narrates the events of Judgment Day with this vivid and dramatic description aimed at teaching doctrinal truths and awakening righteousness through fear, which for them was as legitimate as putting up a sign, danger, road is out, the bridge is out ahead. It was very much trying to keep people from destruction. Wigglesworth wrote other significant works such as God's Controversy with New England, another Jeremiad, and a poem called Meat Out of the Eater, which comes from the story of Samson. But this mode, this prophetical address, the Jeremiad, is very distinctive of American poetry. I want you to listen just to these lines of Walt Whitman because he's a master of the Jeremiad as well. He completely transforms it. But you can see how Whitman even is indebted to this very Puritan mode. This is from Song of the Open Road. Really rousing poem. It's just a portion of it. Whitman writes, this is in the late 19th century. Out of the dark confinement, out from behind the screen, it is useless to protest. I know all and expose it. Behold, through you as bad as the rest, through the laughter, dancing, dining, supping of people, inside the dresses and ornaments, inside of those washed and trimmed faces, behold a secret, silent loathing and despair. No husband, no wife, no friend, trusted to hear the confession, another self, a duplicate of every one, skulking and hiding it goes, formless and wordless through the streets of the cities, polite and bland in the parlors, in the cars of railroads, in steamboats, in the public assembly, home to the houses of men and women, at the table, in the bedroom, everywhere smartly attired, countenance smiling, form upright, death under the breastbones, hell under the skull bones. Really insightful description of the underbelly of the social individual, and he's using it for different ends. But you notice how it all begins. Well, Wigglesworth, people are drinking, they're supping, they're eating, they're having a great time. Whitman is setting up a similar scene where under all of this facade, there's a deeper reality. And this is part of the spiritual insight of Whitman, even though he's very, very different theologically from the Puritans. But this is how this mode will carry on. And once you see it, you'll see it all over, especially in Ginsberg's Howl. Definitely not a religious poem. Um, or in some ways, perhaps it is. It's not a theological poem, but it takes this mode. So with Bradstreet, we saw the holy domestic after the mode of the Hebrew Psalms. In Wigglesworth, we find the fire and brimstone of the Hebrew prophets come to America. Finally, in Edward Taylor, one of the things we find is the holy devotional mode developed in its fullness. I think Bradstreet does it well, but Taylor does it in he's more bold in his metaphors. So I'm saying this is perhaps the beginning of really the devotional mode in America. Edward Taylor was born in Leicestershire, England, also not a colonist born. He was born in 1642. He was raised in a Puritan family, and his life was marked by these strong religious influences. His father was a Puritan minister. He himself attended a nonconformist school. And when the monarchy was restored with Charles II, you remember that in my lecture on YouTube about the Augustan age, when Charles II came back, the law soon required that all ministers would conform to the Church of England. And at this point, the Puritans were nonconformists, had been for a while. And so that was when Edward Taylor left. He refused to conform, and he immigrated to Massachusetts in 1668. So he very much wanted to continue his ministerial duties and felt it was very important, realized he couldn't do so in England. So he went to New England, and he studied at Harvard. He completed a degree in 1671. And soon after, he became the minister and physician of Westfield, which is way out in western Massachusetts. It was a frontier settlement back then. Wigglesworth, by the way, also was somewhat of a physician. So sometimes you would get ministers who would play both roles, especially in these settlements. Taylor's life in Westfield was challenging. It was right on the frontier. It was marked by personal and communal hardships, frequent conflict with Native Americans, and the devastating impact of King Philip's War. And through all these difficulties, Taylor served as a minister of Westfield for over 50 years. That's a long time. And it was during that time when he wrote most of his poems. His poetry reveals the struggles of maintaining religious discipline and unity, but it also struggles with this invisible relationship between the soul and God. And this is where I think Herbert really lives on, because that's what Herbert's about, the temple. It's about that relationship. And unlike his contemporaries who might have seen themselves as part of a broader English literary tradition, neoclassical style, Taylor's writings are deeply rooted in the specific context of New England Puritanism. His poems often address the communal concerns of his time, including secularization. It's at the end of the 17th century when Boston starts becoming less of a religious center and more of an industry hub. And that changes things. And it was a change that Taylor felt. So the later years of his life actually overlap with that period. But some of the most moving poems of Taylor's, in my opinion, are those spiritual reflections that verge on ecstasy. I think ecstasy is something that we don't often get with Puritans. It happens. But I don't think they often talk about it. And that's why I'm highlighting this. And this is from Meditation 1. I just want to share the screen here for Edward Taylor's Meditation 1. It begins, what love is this of thine that cannot be in thine infinity, O Lord, confined? unless it in thy very person see infinity and finity conjoined. What hath thy Godhead, as not satisfied, married our manhood, making it its bride? O matchless love, filling heaven to the brim, o'errunning it, all running o'er beside this world, nay, overflowing hell, wherein for thine elect there rose a mighty tide, that there our veins might through thy person bleed, to quench those flames that else would on us feed. Oh, that thy love might overflow my heart, to fire the same with love, for love I would. But oh, my straitened breast, my lifeless spark, my fireless flame, what chilly love and cold, in measure small, in manner chilly, see, Lord, blow the coal, thy love and flame in me. The conceit is beautiful. The metaphor, long extended metaphor is a conceit. We've seen this in the metaphysical poets. My lecture on the metaphysical poets introduced this idea. I see Taylor definitely carrying forward some of the things that the metaphysical poets did, including Herbert, but also Donne. There's this Dunnian intensity, I guess you can call it. I'm not sure if that's the right adjective, but this Donne-like quality. Love is the metaphor, overflowing, uncontainable, begins with this, well, Trinitarian theology. Love as the circulating energies of the Trinity, the Son, the Father, the Holy Spirit. Uh, Love is seen to flow into and out of currents of infinity. But here, not content, but to bring manhood, humankind into the Trinity, which is what happened after the ascension, because Christ comes back into heaven with his body, which is interesting to think about. The second movement here begins in the heaven. Now we see it overflowing, matchless love filling heaven to the brim, or running it. And notice how this line begins, or running it. The lines are running, all running or beside another enjambment, this world, nay, overflowing. Listen to him correcting himself as he's thinking aloud, and this is part of the energy of Donne's poetry, and Herbert's as well, wherein for thine elect there rose a mighty tide. So in hell there rose a mighty tide. We're still with the liquid imagery here, but it's changing into corporeal substance of blood, that there our veins might through thy person, that's the Son, bleed, to quench those flames that else would on us feed. So here's a little bit of Puritan, well, atonement theory, Reformation atonement theory, the substitutionary penal atonement, that there's this equilibrium within God's justice that must be satisfied. Justice must be satisfied by something. Christ's love, Christ's blood provides that. So this is a play on the penal substitutionary atonement, transforming it into a bodily or organic metaphor. And then the poem makes this series of almost compulsory turns. Many Puritan poems will either start with self and open up into God, or start with God and then make a personal application. And the latter is what this poem's doing. Oh, I notice the passion here, that thy love might overflow my heart, to fire the same with love. And now the imagery is not liquid, but fire, associated with zeal. From God to eternity to infinity, at last we arrive at the self, thus making the turn from the general to the particular, which is a very homiletic maneuver, where homiletics has to do with sermon writing. So when Puritans would often preach a sermon, it would be, here's what the text says, and at the very end, it would be, here are the applications. And usually they would number them, application 1, application 2, or application to objection 2.1, things like that. It gets very intense. It's a lot of fun if you're into Ramist rhetoric. But the personal application in which the speaker emerges here at the end needs divine help to inflame the zeal and piety. In manner chilly, see, he's crying out for help, kind of like Donne's "Batter my heart, three-person God." Stir me up. You're too gentle. You must inflame and kindle my love. Lord, blow the coal, thy love and flame in me. So this is just an example. Many of his meditations do this, or sometimes they go to the natural world, or there's this pivot, and oftentimes bringing in the domestic world too. Housewifery is one really good poem by Taylor that you should check out. Again, common trajectory that the Puritan poems make. They often move according to the contrasts between God and self in various ways. And in Taylor, that movement is always, nearly always, I'll say, assisted by metaphor and that fulcrum between literal and figurative. So let me introduce our exercise. Now that the lecture is complete, I just want to show you what we'll be doing now. You're going to split into breakout rooms. I think 20 minutes was good last time. 15 might not have been enough. So we're going to discuss some of the prefatory poems to get a sense of how these poems are providing a justification, an explanation for the writing. Group 1 will have Bradstreet's prologue. Group 2 will have Wigglesworth's address to the Christian reader, also in poetry. And Group 3 will have Edward Taylor's prologue. We consider the following questions. How does the poet represent herself or himself? What is the tone of the poem? What does the poet wish to communicate? And why did the poet use poetry to do so? In other words, why not prose? What shared values regarding poems regarding poetry do the poems reflect? So what can we say about the community they're writing to? And we're going to have the same thing we did last time. Read the poem aloud, discuss it, make sure everyone has a chance to share if they want to, and you can use the chat if you prefer. And then pick a spokesperson so when we come back, we can share the group's discoveries and other people can chime in if something is missed. For everyone on YouTube, thanks for watching, and until next time.